Well, I think there are a lot of things. To me personally, I had an opportunity to spend a half an hour with Dr. Harrison Schmitt, who on Apollo 17 was the one scientist who was able to walk on the moon. And he was a man of high integrity, very intelligent man, and I personally was very convinced that he actually did walk on the moon. I think there's a lot of scientific evidence and observations that have been made that would convince people that America really did land on the moon. For example, we brought back hundreds of pounds of rocks from the moon. Those rocks have been examined by over 100 different countries. NASA was very free about sharing them, and they very obviously did not come from Earth. So that's pretty strong evidence. It's a really good question, and actually the Van Allen radiation belts were discovered in the 1950s by NASA, and there was initial concern that they wouldn't be able to survive those belts. NASA knew that it was a risk to send astronauts through the belts, but from the calculations that had been done, they would move through those radiation zones fast enough that with the protection from the capsule, because the capsule was sheathed with material to protect equipment and people from the radiation, that they would move through those zones fast enough that the exposure would probably be about equivalent to a chest x-ray, which it was. The astronauts actually wore dosimeters on the entire mission just so NASA could see how much radiation they were exposed to. Yes, well, there were two things happening. Engineers realized that there's low gravity on the moon. It's about 1/6 of the gravity of Earth. And they did run a pole across the top to more or less hold the flag out. Otherwise, no one would have been able to see it as an American flag. If you look at some of the video when the astronauts are actually planting the flag, it does appear to move around. When the flag is stationary, though, it's not moving. You can look at the videos frame by frame, see the astronauts move, but the flag itself remains motionless. So it's kind of an optical illusion in a sense because of the low gravity. And that's a good question. A lot of that has to do with the optics themselves, with the cameras that were available at the time. Cameras were fairly primitive at that point. That was the 1960s. And the surface of the moon is very reflective. And there's a lot of sunlight hitting those materials, so it's very bright. It's so bright that more or less obscures the stars in the night sky. Now, if you look at some of the pictures that the astronauts took up into the sky that don't include pictures of the surface, you can actually see the stars. So what's happening there is the light from the stars is so dim that the light being reflected from the surface just obscures that light. And I've seen some of those pictures. Actually, some physicists have looked at those pictures and done some calculations. And what they found is that the surface is uneven. There are places where there are little hills and ridges. So again, that creates the impression that the shadows are cast in different directions, but in fact, they're really not. That's more of an effect of the fact that there are small hills and small little indentations in the surface of the moon that bend those shadows. Well, that's a really good question. There's no weathering on the surface of the moon, so there's no running water, there's no wind. So essentially those rocks that are on the surface have been exposed to intense radiation from the sun. They've been bombarded by heavy ions and particles, and you can see that in the surface of those minerals. A lot of the material is essentially just dust, very small particles, but there are, in the samples that were brought back, larger rocks. There's some evidence of what are called spherules, which are left over from big impacts where meteorites crashed into the surface of the moon. So that the weathering, if you will use that word, from radiation makes the minerals have a very different appearance than they would on Earth where the atmosphere protects the rocks. The rover was actually stowed. The lunar module, the craft that landed on the moon, was two parts. There was the lower part called the descent stage, and there were equipment bays in the descent stage, and that rover was actually folded up. It was not really assembled, it was folded up, and when the astronauts pulled a cord, that basically lowered a ramp and unfolded the lunar rover so that it could be used by the astronauts. So it went to the moon, actually assembled, just folded up. You could assemble it, but I think the concern was with the bulky space gloves, it would have been very difficult for astronauts to have the dexterity to put the parts together, because those suits were very bulky. And there was even some damage done by one of the Apollo crews setting up the equipment just because of the bulk of the suits. Well, Neil Armstrong actually was an Air Force pilot. After he left the Air Force, he became a test pilot, so he was a civilian. He was one of the few civilians who flew for NASA, but his background was extensive with experimental aircraft. And he was known as a man who he was very cool under pressure. He didn't panic when things went south. And I think that's one of the reasons that they chose him to land the first lunar module on the moon, because he had a very good track record of staying cool under pressure. The Russians had a very complex space program, and they had actually planned to land a single cosmonaut on the moon. But there was an explosion in 1968 that destroyed their launch facility. They had a rocket blow up on the launch pad. And that explosion was so big that it just basically took them out of the race at that point. There probably are two that I would list. One, both the United States, Japan and China have all sent unmanned probes around the moon since the landings. In fact, some of them are still orbiting right now. All three of those countries have photographic evidence of the landing sites. In fact, you can go online and see some of those pictures. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which was launched by the United States in 2011, photographed almost all of the Apollo sites. You can actually see their footprints in the soil of the moon. You can see the tracks that the lunar rover made in the dust. And you can see the descent stage from the lunar module that acted as a launch pad for the liftoff from the moon. And unless the Chinese and the Indians are complicit with us in trying to fake the moon landing, that would be pretty good evidence. Another thing that we did, we left equipment on the moon, seismometers to measure moonquakes. We also left a highly reflective surface on the moon at each one of the Apollo landing sites that we could shine a laser off of for the purpose of measuring the distance to the moon very accurately. And if you shine a laser on dust or on rocks, it scatters, it doesn't reflect back. Yeah. So the fact that that laser can be focused on the surface of the moon and it will reflect back to the Earth, it's pretty strong evidence that there is a highly machined reflective surface for those laser beams to be reflected back to the Earth from. So I think anybody that really studies the evidence, and there's a lot of it, would have to come to the conclusion that the moon landings were for real. And it's unfortunate because the moon landings are one of the most amazing things that's happened in the history of the human race. And the United States accomplished those moon landings. That is an amazing thing about our country. And I consider it to be almost unpatriotic that people would be so willing to believe that our country would fake something like that in the face of the evidence that is overwhelming that it really did happen.